All right, everybody, come on in. It's Friday. It's the Democracy Stupid. I'm Edwin. This is Jack. I know that the promo to this show said it wouldn't be Jack, it would be Aaron, but that's what happens with live, shows. Aaron had a family incident and he's fine, but he had to go do something else. And Jack, at the last minute, decided he would join me, which I'm very grateful for. Jack, I really appreciate it.
Of course.
Now look, Trump came into office with a very public and very loud support of one kind of Christian leader. And they claimed to stand for all people of faith. But it turns out that is just not so. And the gap between the administration's particular religiosity and those who do not share it has only grown. No one has had a better seat to see that growing rift than Jack Jenkins, who is here. Jack is an award-winning journalist who covers religion and politics. Who knew that would be the most important thing out there for the religious news service? He's the author of American Prophets, how the religious roots of progressive politics and the ongoing fight for the soul of the country. And Jack is terrific. He joined us here, I don't know, a month or so ago. And at that moment, Jack, when we talked, you were covering how religious leaders were showing up on the streets to protest ICE activities in Chicago and Minneapolis. It seems kind of quaint now that the Pope has shown up.
Yeah, it's been wild to observe. Although I will say, I mean, the interesting thing about the most recent dust up between the administration and Pope Leo is that Trump has long had contentious relationships with the papacy, right? I think what some people forget is that, I mean, he got into a spat with Pope Francis during his first campaign. There was back in 2016.
That's right. I forgot that. That's right. Tell us, remind everybody.
No. Back in 2016, he had his, because he was proposing the border wall, Pope Francis was asked about it, and Pope Francis suggested that either the policy is an unchristian policy and appeared to suggest that someone who would back it was not acting Christian is one way of interpreting that. And Trump, as you can imagine, did not respond positively to that. And so that feud has persisted. And then, of course, people forget that the very early stages of this second Trump administration, there was active contention between, Pope Francis and this administration. J.D. Vance had forwarded this argument in justification for the mass deportation effort that the Trump administration was launching. That one of the last things that Pope Francis did before he died was send a letter to U.S. bishops specifically refuting J.D. Vance's theological argument. And since Pope Leo has kind of fashioned himself in many ways as a continuation of many of the trajectories that have been set in place by Pope Francis, it's not entirely surprising that he very much has taken up that mantle. He's been very vocal and outspoken and critical of the Trump administration's immigration policies. And now that has continued into criticism of the Iran war. I will say that it does seem to hit a bit different when it is said in English and with a Chicago accent. And so by virtue of being an American Pope, it does seem to have made this particularly contentious between.
Yeah, as a good Chicagoan myself, I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. And look, the first American Pope is not afraid of American politics.
Right. Yeah. That's very much the case. Yeah.
I think about, what's going on. And I'm just trying to remember a time when the Catholic bishops of the United States have felt so united. I just don't remember one.
Yeah, this has been a remarkable thing that has occurred underneath the Trump administration. And he has done what many critics saw as many Vatican watchers, many Catholicism experts had seen as highly unlikely, which is, at least for certain moments in time, virtually united the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Bishops' Conference here in the United States against a Republican president, right? And it is true on paper. Actually, the USCCB has long taken policy positions that have conflicted both Democratic and Republican administrations. But in terms of how they have spent a lot of their time in public advocating, it is far more likely for them to give Democratic presidents a hard time than Republicans. But that has not been the case under the second Trump administration. We have seen, bishop after bishop be very critical of this administration. I mean, people forget that that was one of the first fights that J.D. Vance picked early on in this administration, was him suggesting that U.S. bishops were not genuinely concerned about immigrants, they were more concerned about their bottom line, as he put it. And so what we have seen is kind of this slow, methodical increase in terms of the frustration that has been mounting between prelates here in the United States and the White House. And I should note that when the most recent dust up between Pope Leo and Trump, when he initially posted that kind of late night statement of criticism against Pope Leo, it happened immediately after there was this
here you can see it. I think this is what you're talking about.
Yeah. That happened immediately after CBS aired an interview with three major cardinals in the United States, who oversee the archdiocese of Newark, New Jersey, Chicago, and DC. That was very critical of the Trump administration.
Yep.
And so, this is a recurring theme, and even some of his allies, right? So, the Bishop Robert Barron, who has appeared multiple times with the president, has been at White House events, sits on the president's Religious Liberty Commission. Even he recently both seemed to criticize the president's posture towards the Pope, and actually in one of the Religious Liberty Commission hearings in the last week or so, voiced disagreement with the policy of denying clergy access to immigrant detainees being held in DHS and ICE facilities, which in the grand scheme of how supportive Barron has been of the Trump was notable.
It was notable. Yeah, I mean, this is a war that seems he likes to have unnecessary wars, but this one seems, I mean, like they canceled the Catholic Charities contract in Miami this week, right? And I think he did that. Didn't he do that with the Episcopal Church early on in his administration? I'm trying to remember.
This is the thing that, if you listen to the White House's narrative, one of the things they claim a lot is that this administration has done more for religion. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that more to religion than any American president. They say done more for religious liberty. But what often goes unsaid is that there's actually dozens of religious denominations and religious organizations that have sued this administration. And one of the first lawsuits that was filed was in the first couple of months when the Trump administration chose to essentially freeze the U.S. refugee program, which, for those who aren't aware, most of the groups that have traditionally partnered with the U.S. government to resettle refugees when they get here have actually been religious groups. And when essentially virtually the only refugees that are being allowed into the United States right now are white Afrikaners, a series of faith groups had sued over that decision. And there was also a separate lawsuit filed by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops over that decision. So, that was partially why when you talk about the Episcopal Church, when they chose to cancel that contract, they were essentially saying that not only did they have moral opposition to only resettling white Afrikaners, it was also the case that they weren't doing much resettling anyway, because the administration had frozen these contracts and frozen all the entries of refugees into the U.S.
So, I mean, you said the administration is claiming that it has done more for faith than any other administration. And I listened to the White House faith office leaders on the White House lawn the other day, and they claimed that they were going to do Easter right. I might add, that was the same day I think Jesus was being, the president was posting himself as Jesus. But they didn't just say we're going to do it right. They said no other past American presidents have not honored Easter properly. Like what is this going after everybody else to say that we have the true faith and no American president has been good for religion before us?
What I think is fascinating about this, there's a couple of things going on here. One dynamic is that evangelical Christians in particular, particularly conservative evangelicals who are politically active, have taken a posture for decades now that the U.S. government, and particularly Democrats, do not represent them. And one thing that happened in the 70s, 80s, and particularly the 90s was this claim of evangelical voters in particular being values voters. And in many ways, owning in the public sphere this idea that they are religious voters. Now, the reality is that there's a lot of religious voters, and Democrats, have an interesting challenge. Actually, when Democrats run for office, they often have to appeal to some of the least and most religious voters at the same time, because both of those sit within the Democratic Party. But in
have you ever been in a black church? I mean,
exactly. I mean, there's only one active clergy member in the U.S. Senate, and it's
right.
Warnock,
From Georgia.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And so, like that dynamic often gets obscured, and so what we see here is that, like, when they say that, although I will say, if it's the interview that you're referring to, they do a little more couching than they often do. Sometimes you'll hear people say that, this is the first White House faith office. That is not true. There has been a White House faith office for neighborhood-based partnerships that actually began under Bush, was continued throughout the Obama administration. And actually, the first Trump administration dismantled that office and then founded a new one that Paula White briefly led for the last year and a half of that administration. They've redone it. It is true that they moved it into the West Wing, and that but it's, one, we actually don't entirely know the nature of the work of that office in terms of what they do day to day. But it does seem to be particularly reflective of conservative Christians in general and evangelical Christians in particular. There was some Catholic representation, for instance, at that Easter celebration, and they did mention, like some Jewish leaders with the Passover celebration as well. But disproportionately, Paula White, who runs that faith office, is herself an evangelical Christian pastor. And that posture, that position, and that faith group's particular interests not only disproportionately helped catapult Trump into power to begin with, but seem to be, many critics have argued, are disproportionately represented in the policy positions of this administration. Even if other faith groups have come out against them, it is notable, for instance, that when Trump posted that image of himself resembling Jesus, there were actually a number of critics, even within conservative evangelical spaces, that criticized him for that. But Franklin Graham, who spoke at that same Easter celebration, by the way, was one of his lone defenders in that space. And that is not surprising, given that that is part of the very specific group of evangelical folks that he has surrounded himself with since his first campaign for office.
And what form of defense did Franklin Graham offer to make that appalling, no matter what your faith is, insulting image okay?
So, if I recall correctly, and trust but verify on this one, Franklin Graham's statement, which he sent to me as well, argues that, one, he doesn't think that Trump would willingly or knowingly depict himself as Jesus, and two, that when he saw the image, he did not see it as representing, like, he's like, I didn't see any crosses. I did not see it as an explicitly religious image. Now, it is true that if you look at that image, Trump's hands are glowing. There are people suspended in the sky above him. I, as a religion reporter, I will tell you that my first impression of looking at that is that it certainly seemed to resemble Jesus. And I don't know many doctors, because Trump said he thought it was a doctor whose hands glow upon administering medical procedures. But,
Right.
that was basically Franklin Graham's argument, is that he didn't think that it was an inherently religious image. Now, one of the first people to criticize Franklin Graham over that was former Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who I should note is a self-described Christian nationalist. And she posted an image of, like, the one that Trump had posted alongside an image of Jesus, and noted the visual and aesthetic similarities. And she actually called Franklin Graham out for that, saying that, I don't believe this, or I don't agree with this. So it's been interesting to see this interplay within Trump's own circles.
I was just, look, I'm a Jewish guy. I was disturbed by that image for a lot of reasons. Sean, do you have that image? If you do, can you put it up? There was something about it. It's clearly, as you say, glowing hand. The iconography feels very traditional. You can see Jesus in an iconography like that. But flying over his head are armed soldiers, are weapons of war. Right? You see U.S. military planes flying over his head. And whatever that monster is on the top, which I don't understand what that iconography is, but and this flag, I just think there's a there is something about the administration's view of faith that is that carries through to the way he acts in every other way, which is coercion is it at its core. And that does not seem to be the message of any of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So I thought it was blasphemous, just straight out as iconography. Very strange.
Yes, a couple of things there. One, I should note that the unclear being immediately above him with like either horns or like a demogorgon mouth. That what we do know is that there is an original version of this image that was shared in February that did not have that. So something or someone altered the image from the original to that. So I have not seen reporting that it's figured out when that was added or what it was supposed to be. But a couple different things here. One, that you're talking about the iconography, like the American flag, right? And taking, if as many critics have said that, if they say that this is an overtly religious image, the idea of conflating American iconography with religious iconography that is something that has appeared a lot in this administration and surrounding this administration. We've actually seen a couple of different agencies, the Department of Defense as well as the Department of Homeland Security, kind of invoke faith, and in particular Christian faith, alongside these images of weapons of war, what have you. I think there's one with Hegseth actually like reciting a Christian prayer as images of weapons of war flash in the background.
On the one hand, it's a real Christian prayer. It's not Quentin Tarantino.
Right. We can talk about that.
We will.
There is, I think many critics have argued that this is evidential of Christian nationalism. Now, I think there are two things that are true there. One, it is true that there has been lots of instances in the American past of like religion in general, what is sometimes referred to as a civil religion, alongside images of American iconography. What critics allege is that the particular brand of Christian nationalism that has been embraced by some of the members of this administration has kind of amped that up to 11, and that it kind of really aligns. And I should note that it is absolutely the case that on the one hand there are certain faith communities that have embraced this. There are certain things called patriot churches that kind of cropped up around in the aftermath of January 6th, actually. And then it is also true that there are many religious traditions who refer to this as blasphemy and heresy. And to make things even more complicated, Doug Wilson, who is the person who oversees the worship service that Hegseth himself attends, who is a self-described Christian nationalist, he referred to Trump's image as blasphemous in a statement to me and publicly. So there's a lot going on here all at the same time, in terms of, and I should note, he's also very critical of Paul White, who was the person who was speaking in that video earlier. There's a whole intra-MAGA fight happening within MAGA Christianity, but that gets away from your original point, which is that iconography, that imagery has appeared a lot over the last 8 years in the various Trump administrations.
Yeah, I'm a fan of Machiavelli. I think he's much misunderstood. But in The Prince, he has a chapter on the armed prophets, and he lists who they are and what they did. And surprisingly, not included in that list is Jesus. Right? His faith was not an armed faith. It was it overcame the armed Romans. So it's just it's interesting to me and odd and frightening in a way. I guess let's talk about Pete Hegseth and the Pentagon. I mean, what the hell's going on in the Pentagon?
So this is a lot. So a few things are happening at the same time. One, and I think this is noteworthy. One, I should caveat this by saying that religious expression in the U.S. military is not unusual. There's an entire chaplain corps. They are very active. The Pentagon has dedicated worship services long before Pete Hegseth got there. Mm-hmm. What Pete Hegseth has done has created his own worship service, and there are posters for it that say Sec War worship service, and Secretary War being how he describes himself, and that is a recurring event that happens monthly, it seems, and that is very unusual. Hegseth himself usually speaks at this. And the people he has come in to kind of give, sermons at these events have been overwhelmingly evangelical, if not exclusively. And we have not been privy to every one of these worship services, so I don't know everyone who has preached, but also disproportionately represented within that core of preachers who have shown up to these events. At least 2 of them have been members of the the Communion for Reformed Evangelical Churches, the CREC. That is the denomination that I mentioned Doug Wilson before. That is the one he co-founded. And so that both the pastor of a CREC church that Hegseth has been attending in Tennessee before he became Secretary of Defense has spoken. He spoke actually at the inaugural event, if I'm not mistaken. And Wilson himself has also spoken at one of these events. That is noteworthy. The CREC is not a very big denomination. It is a very small group. Doug Wilson has kind of emerged as this significant figure in conservative circles over the last few years, particularly in the aftermath of during the pandemic. Again, self-described Christian nationalist. He has argued that women, his argument is that households should vote as opposed to individuals. If a woman is single, she theoretically could vote, but if she is in a household, the understanding is that votes as a household with the man as the head of the household. He is taking a myriad.
Give me a second just to absorb that for a minute.
Yeah.
Is that being preached in the Pentagon? Is he saying that when he is in the Pentagon and having these services?
So Wilson did not preach that on the day that he addressed. We have footage of that. And I should explain. So that there was that church in Tennessee that Hegseth attended. There is now a worship service that is happening in the District of Columbia called Christ Church, DC. It's a little confusing because it is not actually a church. It is a worship service that is run by Christ Church in Idaho, which is Doug Wilson's church. And so it is a rotating band of preachers at that service. And in terms of who is there, and Hegseth is a regular attendee. I went to the inaugural service. I was present in the back of the pews when Hegseth was there. The opening argument from the pastor that day was worship is warfare. That's what the preacher said that day. And just to give you an idea of how important that is, when I was actually at the Pentagon yesterday, where they had a press conference, and Hegseth kicked off that press conference with some opening remarks that including him directly referencing a sermon from that worship service. In which he used it as an argument to refer to some members of the press as Pharisees. But that was the point of invoking that. But I bring that up just because this faith is playing a powerful role. So while I don't know if Doug Wilson is saying that specifically to Pete Hegseth, we do not know if Pete Hegseth specifically agrees with everything that Doug Wilson preaches. The influence of that tradition on Hegseth it appears to be, by Hegseth's own intimation, somewhat significant.
Jack, what does that mean for prosecuting a war against a Shia nation when he thinks prayer is warfare?
Worship is warfare.
Worship is warfare. So
right.
What does he think is going on? How does that influence? I don't know how to ask this question. If there's no war, if we're at peace, is he out of a job because he's a Secretary of War? So we have to have war. And we have to have war because worship requires us to worship in the same way. And these infidels on the other side of the planet don't. And so we have to be at war with them. I mean, does he think we're in a holy war?
So this is actually an interesting question because because your top line question of like how Secretary Hegseth makes sense of this war theologically is an open question. Yeah. And I think unlike previous eras of American history, I think it's a very live and important question, given the primacy that Secretary Hegseth himself has placed on his faith, right? Like It is common for him to begin these press conferences that are designed to give updates on the Iran war with direct appeals to his faith. And again, he's citing sermons that he had preached to him. So it is very clear that from his perspective, and I should note, Pete Hegseth actually kind of went on an interesting religious journey to land in this space. He is not a longtime member of the CREC. It came relatively later in his life that this has been an animating feature of his.
God made me good, but not yet.
Yeah. And so but I don't like I would love to sit down with Secretary Hegseth and hear how he theologically interprets this. And it's not even clear, who his immediate conversation partners are with that theology, right? If he is talking to Doug Wilson every day, if he's talking to other people. But it is the reason I'm saying it's a long-winded way of saying I too have significant questions about whether or not how he's interpreting this, because he certainly seems to be invoking, prayers that in one of them, which says, because one of the prayers he's led at one of these worship services included the line, we should, I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but we should have military action against people who deserve no mercy. That is a term, right? And that is a profound theological statement to make, that there are human beings that deserve no mercy. And again, he was reading a prayer for someone else, but he decided to read that prayer. And I have lots of questions about how that animates his own theology.
I do too. And what faith tradition it comes from. I mean, it's so bizarre to have this conversation about the executive branch of the United States of America, where there is supposed to be a separation of church and state, and there actually has been one for most of our history. But is there an orthodoxy among the administration's faithful, or are there competing theologies in this group that's controlling the religious dialogue in the White House? I know it's a bizarre, crazy question to ask, but it looks like there's a faith war going on inside the White House, and it has consequences for all of us in the country.
No, I think one of the more interesting developments of this second administration is that there are competing theologies, right? So Doug Wilson, who I've talked a lot about, was openly critical of the idea of placing Paula White as head of the White House Faith Office. He had a bit of a nuance on that. He was like, well, if essentially arguing that if the office doesn't matter that much, then whatever. But the implication, this is my interpretation, is that of his argument was that if it matters, then I would not like that. Now you have to remember he opposes women's ordination, full stop. Right.
Right.
So
right. I'm sure he'd be happy with her husband having the job. But
so like that. So there's that dynamic, but this is an interesting rift because Trump has surrounded himself with a very specific subset of evangelical pastors during his rise to power. They were interesting in part because they were reflective more of the charismatic Pentecostal tradition of evangelicalism, which, while not absent from politicized evangelicalism, were not disproportionately represented. It's actually really interesting that they have become very politically involved. And so, whereas the kind of Doug Wilson verse, for lack of a better term, the expanding influence of that world within the administration does seem to be directly at odds with the kind of Paula White verse, as it were, in terms of many nuances. Now, as a political reality, I'm not sure there would be a ton of it would be a distinction without a difference, for instance, for who they might see as their political opponents. But it is, doesn't seem to be a single operating theology so much as there is now I'm doing a little oversimplification by even making it two camps, but these are two very powerful religious camps in the Trump administration that do not necessarily see eye to eye at all.
Is there, over history, religious religions have had theology, doctors of theology, a great deal of ink spilled about what the religion actually believes, what it means. Does that exist for these two groups? Or is it more of pastor-led in the moment kind of thing?
Well, so evangelicalism in general, right, often has a more congregationalist, non-denominational bent, right? You find it more often in those spaces than others. And so by design, a lot of, if you have a more congregationalist tradition, more power is vested in the individual pastor than in the collective, right? And which has been interesting because that tradition has also done a very good job of building a political bloc, right? Which is kind of the contrary to that. But the Doug Wilson, one, belongs to a denomination he helped co-found, and also seems to kind of have influence beyond just that denomination, right? There are, as many sources I've spoken with have told me for years, Doug Wilson isn't just this figure within evangelicalism in terms of like what he is preaching on Sunday. He also was disproportionately involved in popularizing what's called the classical Christian education movement, which is this very specific group of schools that kind of K through 12 students are educated in. I should note that according to Pete Hegseth, he moved to Tennessee specifically to enroll his children in a classical Christian education school, right? So his influence kind of expands beyond just Christ Church, Moscow, Idaho. He actually has a much broader influence on a very specific understanding of education as well. He does have a denomination, and so is traditionally beholden to that, but it is a very small one. Meanwhile, Paula White, this is kind of charismatic Christianity. It often operates in networks, not denominations, and so she has a very influential group of friends and allies, and they have major events and what have you. But in terms of like, there's no like central council within her tradition that's agreeing on theological norms.
It's fascinating to me intellectually. And frightening I put my faith in democracy, and I understand that when it comes to religion, Americans have many faiths. But it sounds like if some of these faiths say women can't vote, for example, or can't vote if they're married, they run contrary to the kind of democracy we have. And that's a tension for sure, and a very difficult one for a democracy to deal with.
Right. I mean, some of these folks actively challenge what they argue is an aberration of, and this is me speaking in the general, what they argue is an aberration of what they see was the founding, right? They think that America has departed from the ways of its founding, right?
It has. We don't do slavery anymore. We let women vote. There are a lot of ways where in 200 and some years we have grown.
Well, I mean,
we don't go to war with muskets. I mean, there are a lot of things that we don't do that we did way back when.
Well,
send people to space. Oh, speaking of which, let's just change the subject for a minute.
Yeah, okay.
Like I saw you post something about faith on Artemis.
Yes.
Could you forget politics for a minute? What's going on in space with faith?
Okay, this is also like one of my favorite conversations. I will confess my master's thesis was on religion in space. So this is also
really
yes. Wow. And people are maybe unfamiliar, but the space is religion has actually been a relative constant in space. Beginning in like Apollo 8, when they went around the moon in a similar fashion to Artemis. Artemis actually whipped around the moon and came back. Apollo 8 actually rotated around the moon a few times before they came back. And as they rotated around one of the last times, it happened to coincide with Christmas. They actually read from the book of Genesis as they came around. This turned out to be very controversial. An atheist activist sued over this and said, like, this is a violation of separation of church and state. It was thrown out of court by the Supreme Court due to lack of jurisdiction, presumably because it was
so interesting.
But the result was that NASA actually kind of became, they were like, look, if you want to be, this is me paraphrasing, but the intimation was to astronauts was you can express your faith however you need to express it, but we don't need to make that a central focus of the public facing element of the mission. So when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, before they stepped out on the moon, astronaut Buzz Aldrin actually took communion on the lunar surface with a communion thing that he had brought with him. He had sent a signal actually to his home church that was supposed to celebrate around the same time. And then I should note, in the classic fascinating aspect of the American context, Neil Armstrong declined to participate. Right. So like that is like the fascinating dichotomy that was existing at the same time.
That is that's fascinating.
And so that tradition has continued. Astronauts in the International Space Station and on the space shuttle have frequently celebrated their faith in private and occasionally breaking through into public ways. Victor Glover in particular, who was one of the Artemis II astronauts, he when he had previously gone up to the International Space Station, he is a person of faith. He attends Churches of Christ, which is a very specific denomination, churches in Texas. He actually sent communion cups ahead of him into the International Space Station. And he before he went up there, and he brought a Bible with him on this Artemis II mission, and he briefly gave a reflection and referenced scripture right before they went around the moon, right before they lost contact on the other side. What I find fascinating, though, about Victor Glover's public articulation of his faith this go round was that it was very clearly aimed, both of the times he kind of discussed it during the mission, to try to broaden it as much as possible. And I think that's in many ways in keeping with the aftermath of Apollo 8, where in the lead up to the mission, the astronauts were kind of asked about the fact that it coincided with Easter and Passover. And they were kind of like, yeah, we think that's really interesting. And actually, the head of the mission made a point to say, yeah, we just came out of a major Muslim holiday, and we hope we take everyone with us. And that posture of like bringing your own faith however you want to, but also making sure that you're speaking to a broader, more global audience, seems to have been like this interesting line that these astronauts have walked basically ever since Apollo.
Yeah, and I mean, I imagine whatever your denomination, if you have one or not on Earth, humans experience awe, and faith are often found in common. You see it with people when they see the Grand Canyon for the first time, right? Yeah. There's just this sense of we are not alone in this, with something bigger than us. And I can only imagine that coming around the edge of the moon and seeing the Earth rise is one of the most profoundly spiritual, whatever your faith is, moments for a human being. And so you'd want to express it in whatever language you have. And if the language you have is the faith you have, I get that. I do. I think it'd be hard not to feel that.
You know, it's interesting. There's a term for this in space talk, which is called the overview effect. It's this like when you see the Earth from above, and for the very few number of people who have gone to the moon and back, like being able to see the totality of the planet. It has this profound effect on it. It's actually been fascinating to watch unfold in real time with the press conferences with these astronauts since they've gotten back. Like you can see them wrestling with how to articulate this. Now, you will sometimes hear religious people argue that, well, of course, that would make people religious. And interestingly, the overview effect has a variety of different impacts on astronauts, some of whom it has broken their faith. Others, it has centered their faith, and some of whom it has said it's just actually doubled down on my lack of faith. And so how it impacts people seems to be like pretty varied, but that sense of awe and profundity is shared. Like that's the one that people talk about.
That's a natural human experience. And the way we have wrapped our arms around it as human beings is to manifest it in a great variety of faiths on this planet.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, maybe that's kind of the piece there. It's like humans are going to be human wherever they are. So they're going to bring faith and no faith and whatever else with them, even to the moon.
All right. So Jack, we are nearly out of time. And just in a couple minutes, there was also this interesting thing that happened this week, and that you noted it, about anthropic and religious outreach. Yes. So let's go from space to AI. What's going on?
Yeah, that's, and I think I need to include a disclaimer, which is that I am one of the authors for whom Anthropic trained their AI on, and there is an active lawsuit against. So there was a lot of authors for whom that is the case. So I just want to be very clear that is a very large list.
But fair disclosure.
But in addition to that, I mean, so it seems that they have had a couple, at least, different meetings Anthropic has with religious leaders. One of them seems to have been explicitly with Christian leaders, and one of them seems to be with more, just this past week, with a broader multi-faith group. It seems to be around this concept of discussing ethics and ethics in AI. Now, what I find really interesting about this is that these meetings have been leaked to the press. I have spoken to at least one of the participants in this in this meeting before about AI and ethics and tech and ethics, and that individual did not disclose in the past who they have had conversations with. So it's interesting to me that this is something that is out there. I mean, it's the context that's worth noting is that Anthropic is under a lot of scrutiny, both from the federal government and from the masses in terms of the ethics of what it has participated in.
And I might add, has just leased a huge amount of office space in London. Because
there you go. I did not know that part, so thank you. That's I'm informed. And then I should note that the religion tie back here is that one group that has been disproportionately involved from the early stages of trying to talk to tech groups about this is the Vatican. The Vatican had folks years ago that they were running around Silicon Valley trying to talk to tech executives about the ethics of what they were building. And it's an open question as to whether to what extent that has had an impact. Anthropic has kind of talked about how do you build like an ethical AI? What does it mean for it to be ethical when you have competing concepts of ethics throughout human history, much less between different theologies? But the Vatican has hosted multiple meetings with tech executives specifically to discuss the ethics of tech in general and AI in particular. And Pope Leo has been, by virtue of taking the name Leo, which is a kind of an appeal to a papacy that had a lot to do with labor, there is a lot of rumor that he may produce either in his rhetoric or even potentially in an encyclical or an apostolic exhortation specifically documents and thoughts on the ethics and theology of AI. So I think Anthropic is either part of that conversation or trying to get ahead of that conversation. So I'm curious how it shakes out.
So we're out of time, Jack. I love this conversation, and I take a lot away from it. Including I have a daughter who's interested in the law of space. So this conversation that you told me about not having jurisdiction, believe me, I'll be calling her as soon as we're done.
Please do.
I appreciate it as always. And thank you. I know I didn't give you a lot of notice, but you came prepared.
Oh, of course, no worries. I'm happy to. And just to be clear about that disclosure, that what I was saying was that my book was trained on their AI was trained on my book against my consent among a myriad of authors, just in case people didn't understand.
No,
okay, but no, always happy.
But you know what? I am glad they trained on your book because I learned something.
Here's hoping.
I mean, I think AI is only going to be as ethical as the stuff it's trained on.
Oh, interesting argument. There you go. I mean, this is. Oh man, I could talk about this for hours. I would very much.
Well, we'll have another conversation.
There we go. Let's do it.
All right. Thanks, Jack.
Y'all take care.